Morning, everyone. I welcome you all to this keynote session at the third International Conference of NPPA. Thank you for joining in with us today. My name is Sargam Bhatnagar. I'm honored to be the moderator for this session. It is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker of the session, Professor Jeanne Nakamura. Dr. Jeanne Nakamura is a professor of psychology and director of the Quality of Life Research Center at Claremont Graduate University, California. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago's Committee on Human Development. She helped establish Claremont's Quality of Life Research Center with Csikszentmihalyi in 1999 and the university's Positive Psychology Graduate Program, which offered the first doctoral degree focusing on positive psychology in 2007. She studies positive psychology in a lifespan developmental context with a focus on adult development and aging. Her research interests include flow and vital engagement, good work and good mentoring, and how these relate to individual and collective well-being. In her work on aging well, she has focused on prosocial commitment as a model for positive aging. Among her works on these and related topics, Professor Jeanne is co-author of Good Mentoring and co-editor of Positive Psychological Science. She is a member of IPA's Council of Advisors and has helped organize convenings on alternatives to materialism and the psychology of well-being and its ecological implications. With your extensive expertise and experience, we truly feel privileged to have you with us, Professor Jeanne.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. I would also like to go ahead and introduce our esteemed session chair, Dr. G. Padmaja. Dr. G. Padmaja is a professor and head at the Center for Psychology, School of Medical Sciences, University of Hyderabad. With an MA, MPhil, and PhD in psychology from Osmania University, she specializes in counseling, health psychology, psycho-oncology, geriatric health, and women's health. She has been an educator since 1995, previously serving at Osmania University before joining University of Hyderabad in 2007. Dr. Padmaja has contributed extensively to e-learning, developing MOOCs and online psychology courses for various academic platforms. Her research spans mental health, resilience in cancer patients, and aging with numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals and books. She has led multiple research projects, including studies on psychological interventions, reproductive cancer care, and work-from-home dynamics. An active member of academic and professional organization, Dr. Padmaja has also serves on editorial boards and ethics committees. She is a dedicated mentor, guiding doctoral research and fostering academic excellence in psychology. On behalf of Team NPPA, I warmly welcome you, ma'am, and invite you to take charge of the session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So it's an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome Professor Jeanne Nakamura to this session. And her expertise is very well illustrated in the introduction which Sargam has given. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to chair this session. I welcome Professor Jeanne to please start your session.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the kind introductions, and also I'm really honored to have the opportunity to participate in this conference. And I wanted to talk a little bit today. Let me see if I can launch my PowerPoint. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit today about some topics that were sort of near and dear to my colleague and mentor, Mike Csikszentmihalyi's work. One is the concept of attention, and a second is the concept of flow. And I want to relate them to some research that the Quality of Life Research Center has done over the past several years on prosocial commitment, focusing on older adults. So it's a little bit, this topic of attention, I think in some ways was the thread running through a lot of Professor Csikszentmihalyi's work. So I'm going to start there. The world, around the world, we face a lot of severe social problems of various kinds, including climate change and poverty, and many others. And you might wonder why I'm interested in attention, flow, and prosocial commitment with a starting point like this. But I think that attention is the resource that we each have, and how we deploy it affects our ability to address those social problems. You might also wonder why a topic like flow appears in a talk on our response to the social problems that we face, but I'll try to address that as we go along. So attention, which I've already mentioned, is maybe the precious resource that individuals possess, is affected by a whole host of factors. And maybe the starting point is the notion that the claims that are made on our attention are endless. They're boundless. And you could think about that in the society that we live in now, where we're constantly confronted with screens in daily life, almost from the earliest years of life on. But this is true in many ways that have nothing to do with technology. It's also the case that the patterns that shape our attention evolve over time, over historical time, as sociocultural changes occur. And again, that's not just a matter of the most current technologies, but cultural changes and social changes, social structural changes of all kinds, as they've evolved over historical time. So this means, given the claims of on our attention, that regulating attention can be challenging. It can be challenging at the level of the individual moment, and it can be challenging when one thinks about how one is going to shape their days and their life. And it's also the case that increasingly attention is commodified, that the claims on our attention are part of larger market forces, and that the ways of gaining our attention are increasingly understood by those who want to treat it as a commodity. Okay, so that's a kind of a general context around the factors that affect how we allocate our attention. And the role of attention has been studied in positive psychology, particularly by Professor Csikszentmihalyi and others like Antonella Della Fave and Marta Bassi in the University of Milan, who share many of the same sort of intellectual premises in their work. It's been studied extensively in relation to the construction of optimal experience or flow and the construction of a good life. So this is at the level of the individual. But Professor Csikszentmihalyi's work on attention was also very concerned with the way in which attention plays a role in the maintenance of societies, the maintenance of cultures, and the way that those are transformed over time. So let me say a little bit more about that. So here's the first premise, and this is that attention is a finite resource. And this has been true from the beginning of time and is not specific to the conditions of life today. It's maybe exacerbated, however, by the conditions of life that we currently face. Because it's finite, it places a limit on what any given individual is able to experience and what they're able to do. And the implication of that and this has been sort of the heart of the work on flow, is that attention has to be selectively invested. So one has to decide where one is going to allocate their attention and why. And that connects back to the notion about the importance of attention to not only individual well-being, but also to collective well-being. Okay, so the second premise is that the allocation of attention is formative, and that's true both at the individual level and also at the momentary level, and also at longer time frames. So a person's quality of experience in the moment is shaped by where they invest their attention and how they do so, sort of the quality of the attention that they pay, as well as the direction of their attention. But it's also the case that the content of your life and the shape of your life as a whole is cumulatively affected by the way that attention is invested in moments and in the course of days. So it's against this backdrop that flow has been of particular attention to us at the Quality of Life Research Center, and that it plays a role in people's lives from the standpoint of thinking about the investment of attention. So I noticed that on the program, there were a number of presentations about flow. So I hope there will be some conversation maybe that we can have about flow more generally when I finish the presentation. So I will say a little bit more about it for those who may not know the construct. So the flow state is one of focused attention that is experienced as effortless, although it's not necessarily effortless, and the activity is not necessarily perceived as or experienced as effortless, but it's the direction and investment of attention that's experienced as not having to be forced. And so the flow state is one of absorption and of the utilization of one's capacities that is enjoyable. And it was contrasted in the original work on flow with negative states like anxiety and boredom and apathy, which are characterized by attention that is divided or states of inattention. And the original model of flow was characterized by both aspects of the experience of being in flow, notably the experience of full concentration and the experience that what one is doing is not divorced or separated from one's awareness. So one is not standing outside of experience and watching it, but rather is fully immersed in it. Maybe a defining feature of being in flow is the sort of losing track of time and feeling either that it has flown by after the fact or that it's passed almost in slow motion, and a loss of awareness of the self, so no longer standing outside and observing the actions of the self, but being fully immersed in the activity. And so I'm not going to go through all of those, but I did want to also note that the original model identified proximal conditions that were in place when someone entered flow and stayed in flow. And surely the best studied of those is the relationship between the opportunities for action in the environment that are provided by the activity that the person engages in and the capacities for action that the person is aware of bringing to bear in that situation. And then there's also sort of the ongoing interaction with the environment in an activity, which is characterized by proximal goals rather than distal goals, and by an ability to identify feedback in the environment that sort of regulates the ongoing activity. So those aren't necessarily what you would call antecedents that are present beforehand and not present during a flow experience. Rather, there are conditions that are present throughout and that are kind of constitutive of the experience. So that's a little bit about the nature of the experience of being in flow. And I think most people know this experience, even if they have it relatively rarely. And I will present. So this is the model that's usually used when a flow experience is studied at the momentary level, when you can identify the shifts in experience from one state to another as people move through different activities in daily life. And particularly when studied in that way through the experience sampling method, you can see that the dynamic of flow arises out of the relationship between challenges and skills, much as it was theorized to do. Flow is connected to growth of skill because staying in flow does require continuing to sort of sit at that balance between challenges and capacities for action. So that's just a little bit of background about the concept of flow. And then I want to talk a little bit about the activities in which it occurs. So like much of positive psychology, research on flow and research on its outcomes has focused on individual well-being. So we think about flow in its relationship to things like a sense that life is rewarding or fulfilling. But the flow model actually doesn't specify the nature of an activities or its challenges. And instead, it predicts that the conditions for experiencing flow apply across many different activities. And for the most part, research, including a lot of research that was done in different populations around the world at the University of Milan, has supported the notion that the experience has a common core across different activities. It's the case, though, that there is a set of activities that are almost seem to be designed to be conducive to flow. These include sports, they include games. Interesting, they include learning and craft activities, and these have been studied quite heavily. What has been studied less are prosocial activities, or activities that are intended to increase the well-being of others. There are exceptions. I've noted them at the bottom of the slide, and these include studies of a population like the ones that samples I'll be talking about are drawn from. That's the research by Colby and Damon, looking at what they called moral exemplars, what I'm going to call exemplars of prosocial commitment, as well as other research on individuals with pro-environmental concerns or in helping occupations. Okay, so to return to this notion of attention and collective well-being that I raised earlier. So Mike Csikszentmihalyi's work it looked also at the notion of the relation of attention to society and culture, as I mentioned. And the claim from a cultural and social evolutionary perspective is that attention shapes the structures, the institutions, the ideas, the cultural practices that persist over time. Only those that receive attention are able to persist. And that means that because attention is finite, in some way, you could talk about institutions or practices or ideas as competing for survival. That also means that the welfare of a society or of a culture is going to depend on how attention is invested now, including the extent to which people today invest their attention in and for the collective future. So that's the sort of the focus of the rest of the talk. I'm going to be focusing less on theory of flow and theory of attention, and more on this question of what it looks like to lead a life of prosocial commitment. So you could say that no social problem is ever going to be solved without the investment of attention. Attention is required both to recognize that the problem exists, to frame the way it's thought about, to find a way to address it, and then to pursue the prosocial commitment. Because again, as I said before, this basic insight of Csikszentmihalyi's, that the fact that attention is finite means that choices have to be made about how it's allocated. So a prosocial commitment can be a source of meaning and purpose for the person who tackles it. And if you want to think about the motivators for the allocation of attention in a certain direction, this would be a candidate, meaning and purpose. And a question could then be, is meaning and purpose a sufficient motivator of prosocial commitment, even at the moment-to-moment level, not at the global level, but in sort of the day-to-day where activities take place. And then a related question, is there any role for flow, which we typically think of in relation to things like sports, games, crafts? Okay, so flow and the selective investment of attention. Flow and meaningfulness, as I've just mentioned, are two important potential motivators of activities, both in the moment and in the long term. And I think we tend to think about them tend to think about them asymmetrically. Flow as something that motivates engagement in the moment, and meaningfulness as something that motivates commitment in the long term. So the model of psychological selection would be a way of thinking more systematically about the idea that attention is more likely to be invested if an activity is intrinsically rewarding in the moment. So if it's a source of flow. And meaningfulness is a second potential motivator, even in the moment. So attention is more likely to be invested when an activity is ongoingly perceived as significant or connected to a larger purpose. So I first thought about the relationship between these, frankly, in a different context. And out of that came the notion that it's important to think about the convergence of the two. We can describe a relationship between the individual and their environment, not necessarily an activity, but any aspect of the environment, as one of vital engagement when those two do both coexist. So the past research that led to my interest in this were interviews with highly creative older adults, and they would typically characterize science or art in terms of its immediate enjoyment or the opportunities for discovery. So ways of talking about flow. But they also talked about the way in which a sense of meaning accrued over time to those activities because of things like their connection to a tradition, a cultural tradition, or a domain of activity, and the tools and values associated with it, and to a community that was engaged in the same pursuit as them. So that was the notion that flow could become a source of meaning, even if initially what was exciting to an individual is just the engagement in the activity itself. So we expect prosocial commitments to be meaningful, and you can ask the counter question there, which is, to what extent are they characterized by experiences of flow? Is that something that might be true, or is the value or the significance of the activity and its potential benefits to others a sufficient motivator for staying engaged in prosocial activities? So just to sort of visualize this, we can think about activities as being, prosocial commitments as being highly meaningful. So the two upper cells in this figure, and the question would be, are they characterized by high flow, low flow, something in between? And for the study, for the understanding of creative lives, we might expect that those lives are characterized by high flow, but the question would be, is it always also high in meaning? and I have there the cell of high flow and low meaning, which Chris Peterson characterized as junk flow. But I think we all can identify an experience that we've had, which is very absorbing, but doesn't carry a lot of significance for ourselves or for others. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about this research that we've been conducting on what we have called exemplars of prosocial commitment, because of the intensity and length of time that they've devoted to addressing one or another social problem in their environment. And these are some of the social concerns that the individuals that we've studied have been focused on. And I won't go into detail about this research, but the individuals that I'm going to focus on in this talk were leaders of programs addressing social problems, and they were all 60 years old or older. I'll mention research that we did using interview methods, as well as interviews using surveys and experience sampling method. So you could ask, why focus on what I'm calling exemplars of prosocial commitment? And you could also ask, why focus on older adults? So let me start with the first of these. And I think the logic of the exemplar method, in some respects, is to fill a gap. So the vast majority of attention in almost any space within psychology will be on trying to understand normative patterns or trying to understand deficit. And the reasons are clear. We want to try to understand the characteristics of the largest portion of the population, and we want to try to understand things where we might try to intervene. But that sometimes completely omits the other end of the distribution. And in the exemplar method, there's an attempt to address this bias and understand the other end of the continuum. There are some characteristics of the body of research that adopts what has been called this exemplar approach. It's often qualitative, trying to understand people in context. It's often person-centered, trying to understand individual lives. And also samples are often small because the populations are often small, and also because they may be hard to recruit. So when you study the small upper end of the distribution that is typically neglected, the hope is that you might identify qualitatively different processes or characteristics that might be informative or generative to study, and or that you might be looking at cases that amplify effects and place features of a phenomenon that are essential in sharper relief because the characteristics are more extreme. So an example of the second, for example, in studies that we did of highly productive scientists, that they talked extensively about discovery orientation, curiosity, intrinsic motivation, which also are characteristics of most practicing scientists that we interviewed in other studies. Okay, so that's a little bit about why the exemplar method. We could also ask, why were we studying people 60 and over? And this is a map from 2012 of the age distribution, the percentage of the population that were 60 and older. And you can see when you project ahead to 2050 that although it's uneven in 2012 in terms of the percentage of the populations in different regions of the world that are older, across the globe, almost everywhere, there's a projection that societies will be aging, more extremely in some places than in others. but the projection is that in 2050, 1 in every 6 people will be 65 or older. So the aging of societies is often maybe typically seen as a social problem. And there are many ways in which the increase in the numbers of a given society that are older requires thinking about vulnerabilities and need. So older adults are not usually thought of as potential solvers of social problems, but rather as part of a social problem. On the other hand, later life is typically one where there are fewer prescribed mandated roles than in earlier periods of life, including young adulthood, midlife. So that's created a lot of interest among gerontologists in prosocial commitment as one possible path for older adults. And so in the rest of the talk, I'm going to use the lens of attention, meaning, and flow to ask whether some older adults tackle social problems and how they go about doing it and how they experience it. So first, and again, these are studies of small samples. These are studies that were conducted only in the US. And so they're very limited in some respects and useful primarily as a kind of existence proof. So what does this look like if it happens, at least in one cultural context? So within those constraints, those fairly significant constraints. So we think first about what's involved in forming a commitment to address a social problem, and set aside for now the question about the subjective experience. We conducted interviews and we also conducted surveys, small samples of people who were over 60 and who were exemplars of the investment of time and energy and attention in some kind of social problem. And we asked the question of what led them to those commitments. So there were, I grouped these into 3 pathways. And one was a response to external demands or requests, like being asked to participate in the creation of some kind of a social program. A second was actively seeking out an opportunity to address a social problem of some kind, because most typically of reaching retirement age and feeling that still had a lot of capacity to give back. And then a third possibility that we encountered was responding to a problem in the environment and responding to it. And the example that I would give of that, and illustrated here, is a individual who was the owner of a small machine shop in the Midwest and retired and moved back to West Virginia, so a rural part of the country, with the expectation that he would spend his retirement hunting and fishing and enjoying nature as he had done as a small child when he grew up there, but discovered that what's called mountaintop removal, a form of very aggressive mining, had destroyed the landscape and the natural environment in the part of the country that he returned to. And with no background of any kind in activism, he became a very deeply engaged activist against coal mining. So that's one example of somebody who, rather than being asked to serve in some capacity, rather than reaching a point in life when he was seeking out an opportunity to serve, encountered a problem and really felt there was no option other than to respond. So you might ask how common these different pathways were in our data. And there's a little detail about the different ways of encountering a problem. One, a direct exposure, like the individual I just described, and the other, indirect exposure through reading about some kind of social problem or hearing about it from others or from the news. And then here are the frequencies. And you can see that the third pathway was in this sample by far the most frequent. We then did a survey to see if other individuals showed a different pattern, but it was actually extremely similar. This was a survey of people who had been nominated because of for recognition nationally in the US because of the social programs that they had created. So that third pathway is the most common. So we looked in the literature to see where else people had studied pathways to purpose. And we did find that there was a research that had been done looking at purpose in life or life goals in adolescents. And also research has been done using this same framework with adults. And these are the three pathways that they identified. One, looking around and observing others, one, actively seeking out and reflecting on the goals that one might pursue, and then the third, reacting to something that's happened that one responds to. And so here you see a very different distribution with that sort of agentic, proactive, reflective, introspective source of life goals or purpose being the most dominant. And you can see here, I'll put them together so you can see how different they are. And it's not just a matter of characteristic of the distinction between older adults and adolescents. Research with college students and research with adults across sort of the span from young adulthood through midlife also in the US also show that proactive, introspective, agentic pathway as being the most common. So, I mean, it is possible that what is distinctive here is the formation of prosocial commitment, as opposed to the broader kinds of variety of life goals that were studied in these other research projects that I'm illustrating with the study of adolescence. Okay, so that's a little bit about the pathways to purpose and the way in which the capturing of someone's attention can be a pathway to prosocial commitment that comes to be the center of the life structure in these older adults that we were studying, and that does seem to be the most common pathway. We actually expected it to be this more proactive pathway, and we're surprised by finding this. But I think it's a really clear illustration of the way in which attentional allocation can be critical to the commitments that one makes, and that it can have sort of unexpected sources in a person's life. So let me shift gears and talk a little bit about the experience of forming a commitment to addressing a social problem and then pursuing it. And in this context, the research that we've done is use the experience sampling method, and I'll say a little bit about it for those who might not be familiar with it. It's kind of tailor-made for this kind of question where what you want to understand is not a person's global perceptions of their experience, but what they're actually experiencing in daily life, moment to moment. Because the question here is a person who's pursuing a prosocial commitment, particularly somebody in later life, when what we our understanding of motivation in later life is that present moment experience is very important. Is it coming at the cost of individual subjective experience or something else? So here's an example of an experience sampling form, a very early one. This is from research that Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Reed Larson conducted with adolescents. So it's not the population that we are studying, but it does show you the items that are commonly widely used to measure flow, which include a measure of perceived challenges, a measure of perceived skills, concentration, and then I've also indicated an item about motivation because I'm going to talk about that later. And this is obviously not an experience of flow. This is an experience of disengagement in the classroom in adolescence. But the question that I want to spend the rest of the time on is, to what extent is prosocial commitment a source of meaning and maybe flow at the momentary level? And you would expect it, frankly, to be a source of meaning, because the individuals that we studied were uniformly pursuing activities that they felt were addressing something that urgently needed to be addressed. The main question would be, to what extent does that trickle down into the moment-to-moment experiences that they have at the day-to-day level, rather than being something that they only think about in the global sense. So we conducted a ESM study with 84 people who were leaders of social programs. And when they were engaged in prosocial commitment, and the experience sampling method allows you to compare a particular context or activity to other activities. So comparing it to the rest of daily life, we did find that the sense that what they were doing was meaningful and connected to a larger goal was significantly higher. And then the thing that was interesting was that we found that flow was also significantly higher. And we found that being in the flow quadrant, so if you remember the earlier slide, being in contexts where challenges and skills were both perceived as comparatively high, that was also significantly higher or more likely when engaged in the prosocial commitment than when engaged in the rest of the activities of their daily life. So in this sense, the prosocial commitment was actually motivated, or was characterized by two different motivators of attention, meaningfulness and sense of purpose, but also a sense of enjoyable absorption. So flow in this case was measured by enjoyment and concentration. And then challenge and skill were used to define the flow quadrant. So then the other question that could be asked is, does meaning, do meaning and flow motivate persistence in prosocial activity in the moment? Or is this primarily about one or the other? And we did find that flow is particularly strong as a source of motivation in the moment. So meaningfulness was important, but especially flow. Both predicted a lower concurrent desire to be doing something else, which is a way of measuring motivation indirectly, so less overtly. So then, just to summarize, because I think I was asked to save time for some discussion, and I'll just go back and summarize. At the level of premises, one is that attention is a finite resource and therefore has to be invested selectively. And where it's invested can have an impact on collective well-being. So if it's invested in prosocial commitments versus being invested in commitments that further personal growth or personal enjoyment only. And then this means that it's productive to examine attention processes and motivators of sustained attention, such as flow, in prosocial activity. And as I mentioned, this has been, however, a relatively neglected activity context for the study of flow. And then in terms of forging or forming prosocial commitments, the shift in framing is to think about social problems as something that requires the investment of individual attention. And we did find in our studies that older adults often form strong prosocial commitments because a social problem had captured their attention, not because they were actively seeking an opportunity to serve, and also not because they were being asked or seeing models of service. It has implications for what one might want to cultivate if one were trying to encourage prosocial commitment in any population. It's also the case that this might be specific to prosocial commitment. That requires further research specifically looking at prosocial commitment rather than the broader sphere of life goals and beyond this kind of exemplar context. So we also had looked at the research on using the experience sampling method and found that both meaning and also maybe somewhat surprisingly flow motivated these older adults' investment in prosocial commitment. So meaning was higher and flow was also more likely to be present. And in fact, if thinking about motivation in the moment, flow was actually more strongly associated with it than the sense of meaning and purpose was. So let me take my last couple of minutes to offer a couple of concluding thoughts. The first is that positive psychology constructs and models have been used extensively in the first 2 decades of positive psychology to understand with the goal of encouraging individual well-being. But I hope the example of flow and meaning serves to illustrate that they can also be tools for trying to understand collective well-being and the ways in which individuals connect to collective well-being. And it's also the case that the study of collective well-being can be generative for the understanding of individual level phenomena, right? So prosocial commitment in this case is illuminating the sort of breadth or scope of the relevance of flow for motivating engagement. It is really clear that future research is needed to extend beyond exemplar populations and to extend beyond the specific culture context in which this research was done. The research is, including the experience sampling research, is fundamentally correlational. What I think these exemplar studies do serve as is a kind of existence proof that it is possible for prosocial commitment to be a source of deep and enjoyable absorption, in addition to being experienced in the moment as well as globally as something that is a source of meaning and purpose. So I want to just end with a quote. This is from Mike Csikszentmihalyi's book on flow, which is just to say that a harmonious evolution is dependent on our ability to invest our psychic energy, which is another way of talking about attention in the future. So not only the individual future, but the collective future. So thank you for your attention, and I've left either 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how we're thinking about it, for questions if people have any.
Thank you, Professor Jeanne. I hope I'm audible, Sargam.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you so much. In fact, that was a wonderful presentation, very informative and with illustration of the research of Professor Jeanne and others as well. So a very quick overview of whatever has been presented so far. She started with the 2 premises of attention, talked about the flow, nature of experience in flow, the conditions, the consequences, and moved on to flow and collective well-being and premises about attention and collective well-being. And further, she also elaborated on aspects like flow and meaning as motivators, flow and vital engagement. All through it's important to know that there is an extensive research of Professor Jeanne in all these areas over decades. And she moved on to the exemplars of prosocial commitment with special emphasis on older adults and shared the findings related to the pathways based upon her research, and also later the adolescents and the pathways to prosocial commitment, and she explored towards the last part elaborately upon certain questions like is prosocial commitment a source of meaning and flow at the momentary level and others, and all through the illustration of her research on the experience of investing attention, for example, in prosocial commitments and all has been exemplary, and a very informative and illustrative talk of the research. While I appreciate it thoroughly, as an academician and as a researcher, may I open it to the participants over here for any further questions? Any further quick questions? After the questions from the participants, maybe I would also like to ask one towards the end. Any questions, please? I hope I'm audible.
Audible. And I mentioned this earlier. I did notice, I was really pleased to notice that there were some presentations, which I unfortunately was not able to attend, on flow. So if people have comments or observations about flow that don't necessarily connect to prosocial commitment, I'd be very interested to hear those as well.
So any questions from anyone? Looks like there are several participants. Any questions? There's some chat message, is it? There's one, Sargam, I think.
Yes, ma'am, there is one question. Should I read
Yes.
it out?
Yeah, you can. Yes,
So
please.
there is a question. Pro-social issues can sometimes be very uncomfortable or confronting. I wonder what Professor Jeanne thoughts are on this.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear what you.
Okay, so the question is, pro-social
Yes.
issues can sometimes be very uncomfortable or confronting. I wonder what Professor Jeanne's thoughts are on this.
Oh, okay. Would it be possible for the person who posted the question to provide a little more context?
I think the attendees would not be able to speak, but I can type in the chat to elaborate on the question a little more.
Yeah, the elaboration has been given. For example, climate anxiety or human rights issues.
Yeah, and I think that's why our expectation was that when we had the opportunity to do the experience sampling study, that we might see a sense of purpose, but we might see a lot of negative emotion. And the primary negative emotion that we saw was just a sense of being overwhelmed with the work, but not other kinds of negative affect. I think that's a really reasonable question. We were actually not expecting to see the very high levels of absorption and enjoyment that we saw.
Okay. I think there's one more question also, Professor Jeanne. I'm curious about this, an anonymous attendee. I'm curious about the methodology used in Professor Jeanne's study. How is experience sampling method conducted, and how would it be different from phenomenology?
So if by phenomenology you mean the kind of Duquesne interview method, it's a very different method from that. And I apologize for not explaining it further. It's a method where you're essentially capturing samples of momentary experience at random times across some stretch of daily life. So in our case, we had people responding to the same survey over and over again at half a dozen times across the day for a week. So it enables us to learn about subjective experience, multiple dimensions of subjective experience in real time, instead of dealing with sort of retrospective reconstructions, and in context. So as people move through the context of their daily life. And that seemed really essential for this because we actually know quite a bit about activists' understandings of their lives from various interview studies. but we wanted to see really close to the time when they're having experiences, engaging in the work that they do, what the nature of that experience was for them. So I hope that answered.
So I don't think any further questions are there. We haven't received any further questions in addition to whatever we have just asked you. However, I would also like to know from my side, what is your thought about, or what is your opinion about cross-cultural research in this angle? Cultures play a lot of role, and a cross-cultural research regarding whatever you have mentioned. For example, the older adults, adolescents, and
Yeah, so the research that we've done is pretty severely limited in terms of cultural context. There were in the larger sample, so the interview sample, there were some people who were conducting their work in other cultural contexts. But it's like many things. It's undoubtedly research that would be done in another culture would show completely new insights. And so that would be maybe the most urgent need. I mean, I don't feel like comparison to other age groups is as necessary as understanding what we would learn by moving beyond the limitations of this context. Because, I mean, the flow research has been conducted in many different populations, countries. So we have a better understanding there of what the limitations are in terms of the research that's conducted in, so for example, the US context. But for the understanding of prosocial commitment, because it's so embedded in and connected to sociocultural practices, maybe everything that I've said is would look different in other contexts. I would love it if somebody contacted me and said they wanted to do this research there, because my expectation would be that it would look quite different.
great. So
Yeah, thank you for that
thank you so
question.
much. Yes, yeah, thank you. And yes, I'm sure definitely some of us would look forward to greater collaborations and extension of research to different cultural contexts as well. So with that, I think I hope the organizers are with me. In concluding this session, thank you so much, Professor Jeanne, for that illustrative lecture
Thank
and
you.
for the presentation, and highly informative and insightful presentation. In fact, I'm sure it gave a lot of thoughts related to further research to many of the young participants and the researchers who are here. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
As we conclude, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Jeanne for delivering an insightful session. I also appreciate our audience for their active participation and engaging with the dialogue. Finally, I would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Padmaja for their guidance and support throughout the session. Next, we have a symposium lined up. I will now invite Ekta to take over the next session. Over to you, Ekta. Thank you.